Hi everyone, this is the sixth and last lecture of week 10. And again, a reminder to keep up with your readings from the biblical text. Indeed, if you don't read the biblical text, you're not going to really understand this video. Also, the stuff from the text, though I don't go over it, will appear on your quizzes, okay? Um, the story of Solomon's birth and reign, which we discussed, of birth, which we discussed in the last video, it sets the context for what happens at the end of David's reign, which is described by the time you turn to the book of First Kings. Okay, and First Kings 1, so the first chapter of this book, this begins with a description about how David at this point is now very old. Indeed, he is so old that he needs a young kind of nubile woman, Abishag, to sleep in his bed to keep him warm. And of course, this is a signal that David is no longer fertile enough to remain king, and that therefore a new king is needed. Okay, and it tells in the verses that follow, in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 1 of First Kings, how Adonijah, who is the next in line for the throne, as the two eldest sons, right, Amnon and Absalom, I described how very quickly in the last video about how they were killed off. So they're both dead. So Adonijah is next up, and he tries to hasten the process to become the next king. That is before his father is fully dead. Okay, and like Absalom, his older brother who was killed off, Adonijah is described as also very handsome, which again hints that bad things are going to happen going forward. Okay, Adonijah, we are told, after discussing the matter with David's general Joab and Abiathar, the priest. This is the Abiathar, the priest that survived Saul's massacre at Nob. Okay, and thinking that he has a religious and military backing, okay, to become the next king, starts preparing for a giant kind of coronation ceremony where he will announce his kingship. Okay, now unfortunately the problem is, again, David is not yet dead. Okay, and Adonijah's support to be the next king does not seem as firm as he thought he was. Okay, and we are told that when Nathan, the prophet who confronts David about Bathsheba and as well as the temple, when Nathan hears about this, we are told that Nathan goes into full action. Okay, and he knows, of course, that if Adonijah is able to capture the throne, Solomon, the person who likely Nathan is backs, okay, that Solomon will probably not become king and will surely probably die, okay, as a kind of competitor to the throne. So Nathan goes and tells Bathsheba, who in this narrative does not seem to be the kind of innocent, passive victim as she was earlier when she was having the affair. And Nathan and Bathsheba together concoct this plan, okay? And the plan is that Bathsheba is to go to David, who we're not at all clear whether at this point he's very cogent, right? And she's supposed to ask him, why has Adonijah been crowned king when David has promised her, Bathsheba, that it was her son Solomon who was going to become king? Okay, and while she is telling him this, David, that is, Nathan is supposed to come in and confirm this account. Okay, of course, we are never told anywhere in the biblical text that David indeed has promised Bathsheba or Nathan or Solomon anything about Solomon becoming the next king, thus probably leading to the suspicion that this is something that they made up. Okay, maybe taking advantage of David's senility. Okay, and of course we are told the plot works, and that David, as soon as he is kind of bamboozled maybe by Bathsheba and Nathan, summons Solomon as well as the priest Zadok and several others, and crowns Solomon as king and has him anointed. And we are told that while Adonijah is having this big party, right, he suddenly hears that he's been beaten to the throne by Solomon, right? And he immediately runs and grabs the horns of the altar, which is a sign of mercy, right? And when Solomon is told that Adonijah is grasping the horns of the altar, Solomon makes this promise that he will not kill Adonijah as long as he remains worthy, but will surely kill him if, quote, wickedness is found in him, okay, 1 Kings 1, verse 52. And of course, this leaves a lot of room for Solomon to make up a nice excuse to murder Adonijah, which he will do in the very next chapter. Okay, so with everything all kind of set, David in the next chapter, 2 Kings chapter 2, is now about to, ready to die. Okay, and in this chapter, he seems oddly clear-minded again. Okay, and before he dies, he gives his dear son Solomon some very needed advice. Okay, such as follow the commandments. Okay, always good advice. However, David's advice takes if you read chapter 2, takes a decidedly dark turn in chapter 2, verses 5 and following. And at that point in verse 5, all of a sudden David's, goes from kind of telling people, telling Solomon to listen to God's commands to kind of listing people who Solomon needs to kill off and avenge on David's behalf. And these people include Joab, who is David's faithful general, and this guy named Shammai, who insulted David by calling him a murderer and a usurper earlier. Okay. Now, David's kill list, especially right before he dies, is really weird. Okay, so like, David is king. Why doesn't he kill him earlier, right? If he's so mad at them, right? Indeed, David's kill list is odd as it, as it raises the question of, first, why didn't David kill him if he needed them killed, and also, David is going to die, so why does he care who's alive after him? Okay. And it's very, very telling that these people who David, sort of, commands Solomon to kill, okay, that these people are not a threat to David's rule. David's about to go, okay. Rather, they are a threat to Solomon's rule. Okay, how so? Well, Joab, as I just said, sided with Solomon's competitor Adonijah, and he is an army general, so he has great influence over the armies of Israel. Okay, Shammai, we are told in earlier parts of the text, is a pro-Benjaminite and therefore seems to be part of a larger group in Israel that is still hoping for the return of the reign of Saul's descendants. Okay, in short, they both pose a threat to Solomon's attempt to secure the throne. And so, I mean, isn't it convenient, that Solomon's daddy tells him that he wants them dead as his last dying wish, right? Indeed, of course, this would follow trends, right? It is not uncommon that power transitions, especially in the ancient world, were followed by massacres of by the winner, as they wiped out anyone and everyone who kind of posed a threat to their consolidation of the throne, okay? Now, it is not, of course, just Joab and Shammai. There is one more person left to kill once David, the daddy, dies, right? So we are told, and this is what happens, right? Immediately after David dies, we are told that Adonijah, remember the guy that tried to get himself crowned early, okay, asked Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, to ask Solomon, okay, on his behalf, to give him Abishag as his wife. Abishag, remember, was, David's kind of like living electric heating blanket. Okay, when Bathsheba, we are told, tells Solomon about Adonijah's request, Solomon, understanding immediately what this is about, says, well, he's dead now. Okay, as a woman touched by the king, asking for Abishag was tantamount, and this is what Solomon says, as to asking for the kingship itself. Okay, again, notice that women are conduits and symbols of power. Okay, using Adonijah's request as tantamount to an attempt at usurpation, and now thus having evidence of wickedness, okay, being found in him, right, which is what Solomon says to him. Solomon, of course, promptly gets rid of Adonijah. Okay, yet, I mean, again, this, this tale is very, very fishy. Is Adonijah really so stupid that immediately after David dies, he's going to ask for Abishag, And if he were to do so, why, was Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, also so stupid as to just kind of like innocently ask Solomon on Adonijah's behalf, And anyway, why does Adonijah go to Bathsheba in the first place instead of going directly to Solomon? Okay. Again, you have to kind of try to piece things together from the few clues that we have. And it's probably the case, or this is how I interpret it, that Bathsheba is mentioned here because it was probably Bathsheba who persuaded Solomon to kill off Adonijah as soon as David dies. Why? Well, because he's a competitor to the throne. Right, and that perhaps there was kind of a false pretense of a kind of dishonorable request, right? That was the false pretense given to murder him. Okay, what we have in the text, therefore, is a justification of the bloodbath that succeeded Solomon's enthronement. Okay, and these first few chapters really give us a great little window into Solomon and his character or characterization. And what we know, what we find out is that David's son is even more politically astute and even more brutal than his father. And this may explain why we have so many weirdly favorable accounts of Solomon in the biblical text. All those stories about Solomon's wisdom, for example. Okay, and of course, the most famous story of Solomon's wisdom is found in 1 Kings 3. Again, notice I'm going very fast because I'm trying to cover a great deal of text quickly. Okay, and most of you probably know how 1 Kings 3 goes. Two prostitutes both give birth. One of the sons dies after being suffocated accidentally, it seems. The woman, his son, has died, kidnaps the son who is still alive, and Solomon is tasked with deciphering the identity of the true mother, which Solomon does famously by deciding to cut the child in half, realizing that the true mother would rather have her son be alive. Okay, the point of the story, of course, is to tell you how wise Solomon was. Okay, and yet notice that in so doing, right, it gives you a window into how wisdom was actually understood in the ancient context. Okay, as the story demonstrates, wisdom is not about being smart, okay, per se. Wisdom is really this ability to discern an order, the order underlying what seems to be a chaotic universe, okay? The ability to pierce through the superficial things happening on top to decipher the true order by which God runs the world. Okay, and again, and going further, what a wise person does is that once they understand this order, they realize their place in it and kind of use that order. And by order, they mean power, the power structure by which the world is governed. They understand that and use that knowledge to climb the ladder of success by what? By kissing up, to people that are in higher positions and being strategic, And another way to put it is wisdom in the biblical text is not necessarily ethical. Okay, it is more about being politically savvy or smart. Okay, knowing who is above you and who is below you, and how you need to respond to people knowing that. Okay. This story in 2 Kings 3 about the two prostitutes, among others, such as the visit of the Queen of Sheba in 2 Kings 10, who we are told comes to test Solomon's wisdom, and who, kind of other traditions say that Solomon had a child with. Okay, all of these narratives seem to bind Solomon to wisdom, or a fancy word for that is sapiential traditions in the ancient Near East or in Israel, ancient Israel. And people don't really know why this is. Some speculate that maybe, Solomon supported wisdom writers or wisdom schools, although we have no real evidence about what schools were like in ancient Israel. We also know that, of course, Solomon ruled during a point where Israel was very international, where things were internationalizing, okay? And that, of course, wisdom is an international phenomenon known all over the ancient Mediterranean world. Okay, so maybe this is just kind of a reflection of the times. And we don't really know why Solomon and wisdom are so closely linked, okay? What we do know is that all these favorable stories about Solomon, strongly hint that, of how much control Solomon had over his scribes and over the rest of the country. Okay, unlike with the stories about David, there is no criticism of Solomon, no big story of a misdeed. Okay. However, there are still remaining, right? Even though it's propagandistic, a lot of the text, there's still small hints that things were not exactly as the propaganda kind of initially tells you they are. Okay, so for example, 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1-7 tells of the rise of the bureaucracy and taxes during Solomon's reign, hinting pretty strongly that Solomon taxed the hell out of Judah and Israel. Okay, indeed, the taxing and ruthlessness, okay, might be why Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 5-9, right, very long series of chapters, actually ends up being the one to be able to build the first temple instead of David. Okay, this temple is called Solomon's Temple, or the first temple, and it is differentiated and distinguished from the second temple, okay, which is built later. We don't know quite when, sometime after the 4th century, and this is called Herod's Temple. The second temple is also called Herod's Temple, and this is the temple that's around the time of Jesus, not the first temple or the Temple of Solomon. Okay. Considering how much materials, resources, slave labor, okay, were required to build a temple, okay, a structure of this size in the ancient context, it was probably only after David's conquest that there was enough resources, that is slaves and loot, and maybe with Solomon, additional taxes to build such a thing. Okay, and of course, the building of the first temple, or the Temple of Solomon, would be the key accomplishment of Solomon's reign. Okay. When one starts reading about the construction of the first temple in First Kings 5 through 7 and 5 through 9, what you notice is how strikingly detailed it is. Okay, and the details are kind of so the question is, well, why is it so detailed? Why are we told everything about this structure? Okay, the details hints that the text was likely written after things have gone terribly awry, maybe possibly after the time that the structure, the temple was actually destroyed. Okay, and the reason why it's so detailed is that the biblical text is to almost act as a kind of blueprint, okay, for the future when the temple hopefully can be rebuilt. Okay, indeed, the theme of the thread of exile and destruction is written all over this account of the construction of the first temple in First Kings. Okay, so for example, the biggest kind of clue that this text looks forward to the destruction, or understands the destruction, I guess, is found in First Kings 9, where again, part of the temple dedication, we are told that in the midst of the dedication of the temple, that God slightly tweaks the Davidic promise. Okay, remember this promise, right? Where God promises David that he will always reside in Jerusalem in the temple, and that a Davidite, a Davidic king, will always sit on the throne of Judah or Israel. All of a sudden, this unconditional promise in 1 Kings 9 undergoes a subtle shift. Okay, it is modified. So now what you have is God promising David's descendants will remain on the throne, and this temple will remain standing only if the king and the people obey God's commandments. Okay, and likely this little addendum was added, okay, or inserted after the temple's destruction, to kind of explain why God's promises, the Davidic promise, looked like it was untrue. Okay, several other things to notice in the description of the first temple. Again, I am going very fast because there's a lot of text I'm covering. Everything is covered in gold, and that's everything is unbelievably shiny and bright. Okay, and that's because the temple is a kind of human representation of a divine house, or a house up in heaven. Okay, and of course in heaven everything will be shiny and brighter than in the human sphere. Okay, the temple seems to have 2 chambers, an outer chamber and an inner chamber. And if you want to see a picture, I would advise that you Google, the first temple, or the Temple of Solomon, and Google, and there are 2 huge golden cherubims are placed in the inner sanctum, and of course the cherubim are angelic attendants. Okay, so again, the temple mimics what is up in heaven. It's a kind of duller mimicry of what's actually in place in heaven. Okay, God as a king would have attendants, so of course God down here also has attendants, i.e. the golden cherubims. Okay, the temple is also decorated with lions and oxen, cherubim, lions, palm trees, pomegranates, open flowers, all laid in gold. Okay, and these decorations represent both, of course, the heavens and a kind of miniature earth. Okay, with animals and vegetation and water. Okay, in other words, heaven, or where God dwells, seems to have been imagined as a lush, better, more alive, more shiny, a truer earth. Okay, which is very interesting. Okay, we are told in 1 Kings 8 that with much fanfare, Solomon brings the ark into the temple, sanctify it, and once the ark of the covenant is placed in the inner sanctum of the temple now takes over, and we never hear of the ark again. It's just from this point the ark is lost. Okay. Now, again, I'm going over the reign of Solomon very, very, very quickly, and in part because this is I have limited space and time, but also because Solomon's reign, like I said, is almost pure propaganda. And there's very little interesting stories about this king, okay, because he does nothing wrong, okay. It is only really at the end of his reign that there are small hints that things are not okay. And the main criticism that we find about Solomon is in 1 Kings 11, where it talks about how many foreign wives, okay, Solomon had. And of course, again, this hints of the internationalization of Israel. Okay, Israel was part of this kind of internationalization, which meant more wealth, and also, of course, meant that Israel was becoming like any other nation. And remember that this is a big theological problem, right? When the people first asked for a king, one of the big problems that God has with this request for a king is that Israel will become like just any other nation. Okay, what the foreign wives of Solomon symbolize, therefore, is in some ways Israel's failure to be a country uniquely devoted to Yahweh. Okay, and so this is, of course, a big no-no theologically, and as a result, we are told that at the end of Solomon's reign, that God raised up other countries to attack Israel, just as he did in the period of the Judges. Okay. What we know is that around the time of the end of Solomon's reign, there were kind of larger geopolitical changes that were happening, okay? Indeed, Solomon's success was probably coincidental in some ways, okay? He just kind of came to the throne at the right time, okay? He came to power during a power vacuum when the larger countries around them, like Egypt and Syria, well, they were dealing with their own issues, okay? So there was a power vacuum. Okay, and as a result, Solomon was able to control a lot of the Levant. He was able to maintain his own control, even though Israel was a tiny little country. He was also, to some degree, able to meddle in the affairs of his neighboring countries. Okay. Indeed, the reign of Solomon will be seen as the climax of kingship and the climax of the Israelite state. It's the point at which Israel was the most powerful, the richest, the largest. Okay, and it is also, in hindsight, envisioned as a point when things started to go very wrong for the country and the people. Okay, shortly after Solomon's reign, the larger powers that surround Israel, they will get their stuff back together, right? They will organize, and of course, they will start infringing upon the smaller countries. Okay. Now, the fact that right after Solomon's reign that things are going to go right is hinted at by what happens right after Solomon dies. Okay, right after he dies, we are told that the country splits into two. Okay, the north and the south. Okay, and 1 Kings 11 verses 11 and 13 kind of tries to explain why this happened, why the country split. Okay, by stating that because of Solomon's sins, the Lord revised the promises that he made to David. Okay, we are told that God foretells how 10 tribes out of the 12, so a majority, will be given to someone else. Okay, Jeroboam, this guy named Jeroboam, because of Solomon's misdeed. Okay, of course, the problem with this explanation is, well, if Solomon is the problem, like, why not punish Solomon? Why punish the people that come after Solomon? Okay, but of course, again, everything is being explained in hindsight, and of course, this is what happens by the next chapter, 2 Kings 12. We are told that Rehoboam, who unfortunately sounds like Jeroboam, but it's not, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, comes to the throne, and when he refuses pleas for a tax relief, okay, the prophecy about Solomon and the kingdoms come true, and 10 tribes break away from the rule of Rehoboam, that is a Davidite, okay, a descendant of David, and at this point, when the rules of the two kingdoms break off and when the one country becomes two, what you have is a movement from the United Monarchy, when Israel and Judah, when the north and the south were ruled by one Davidic king, to the time of the divided monarchy. And I'm emphasizing it here because this will almost certainly show up on your quiz, okay? What a divided monarchy is and what a united monarchy is, okay? The period of the divided monarchy, like I said, is when North Israel, sometimes called Samaria, sometimes called the North, sometimes confusingly called just Israel, okay, will split from, okay, the South, okay, also sometimes called Judah. Okay, the North, after they split, will be ruled by a variety of sporadic rulers. Okay, the most famous of which will be the Omri dynasty or the Omride dynasty. Okay, the South, however, Judah, will continue to be ruled by a descendant of David. Okay, and at this point, what happens in the biblical text is that the text start flipping now. Okay, so once the divided monarchy begins, the text will flip from talking about the situation in the south to talking about the situation in the north, then to the south, then to the north. Okay, um, now, remember that the south, okay, Judah, which I said, continues to be ruled by a Davidic king. Well, as history goes, they will last longer than the north, and there's a variety of reasons why. Okay, and as a result of being able to last longer, right, all the editors of the biblical text are probably southern. Okay, and all probably affiliated, therefore, with the Davidic kings. Okay, and of course, considering this, okay, it is no surprise that that when these southern writers write and edit their history, they will have a particular bias, right? They will consistently assess the northern kings as heretics and worshippers of an illegal legal cult. Okay, they will not really like their northern counterparts. Okay, and hence going forward, no king of the north will ever be portrayed positively. No, we have some archaeological records that really do show them as maybe not as bad leaders as the southern writers want you to believe. Okay. Incidentally or interestingly, the period of the divided monarchy is also the point in time at which we start finding extra biblical evidence. Okay, in other words, we can now start comparing the biblical text to histories and archaeological sources from other places in the ancient Near East. Okay, we don't really have anything during the time of the United Monarchy. During the time of David and Solomon, it's almost a blank. Okay, and so doing, when we start comparing, right, we notice that the biblical text is by no means a neutral account of what happened. Okay, indeed, especially with comparison, you can see that the biblical, account is a very particular theological take, that take a very particular viewpoint of the up and downs, the complicated up and downs of a tiny, 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 probably insignificant ancient Near Eastern nation, Israel, during what is a complicated and tumultuous time.